Welcome, everyone. It is my honor to greet you at the first Teens Forum of the year, and a special honor to introduce an event with no precedent. We are welcoming a distinguished professor from the Divinity School, Emerita now, and she will be presenting on her work in the presence of her portrait on the wall. I think this is unique.
I didn't bring the dog. I should have. Had I known the dogs were welcome, I would have brought my dog.
Today, I want to introduce you to our guests for today, neither of whom need much introduction. Wendy Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor in the Divinity School, but also in the Committee on Social Thought, Emerita, in the Divinity School and the Committee on Social Thought in South Asian Languages and Civilizations. So, as she explained to me in the past, she was hired in all three divisions in 1978, and you managed to solve problems in all three simultaneously.
And cause problems.
Wendy is the author of over 60 books. I printed out her CV before coming in, and it was electric out. She is the author of over 60 books, 33 of which I have in the dean's office, and I need to work on the other 27 as well. Look, Getty Rama. She is also the supervisor of some 76 PhD dissertations over 40 years at the University of Chicago, and another 42, perhaps 42, on which you were the committee. We will focus on her latest book today, The Dharma of Unfaithful Wives and Faithful Jackals, in conversation with Professor Richard Rosengarten. Professor Rosengarten, as you all know, is Associate Professor of Religion, Literature, and Visual Culture. He has a storied position in history in the schools as well. You began as a student here around the time that Wendy arrived, did you not? Late 70s?
2 years later.
In 1980 you arrived as an MA student. Rick has been here since then in various capacities, from manager of the coffee shop. No, you were never manager of the coffee shop? How could you not have been manager of the coffee shop?
I was just surfing the coffee
Were you
shop.
ever head of the DSA?
No.
Oh my goodness! You were starting in 1990 through 2000 the dean of students in the Divinity School. From 2000 to 2010, the dean of the Divinity School, and again from 2015 to 2017, a leader of the school for now several generations. The two of you, as is our practice in the dean's forum. Wendy, the author, will say a few remarks about the work. Rick will provide a response in a good school critical fashion. Wendy can respond to the response, and then we'll open up to questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
It's such a pleasure to be back in this room. Such a strange pleasure to be facing myself in the opposite wall. This is the first time I've made a live public appearance since I retired in 2018 and COVID came and I got old and all sorts of things happened. I've done some Zoom lectures, but I haven't actually been in it with an audience, and it's marvelous. I forgot how much I like it. It's really very nice. So shortly after I retired, I finished off a couple of books that I'd been working on for a while. I published a book called Against Dharma, which had been the Terry Lectures at Yale a few years before. I did a book on Winged Stallions and the Wicked Mayors, which had been the lectures I'd given at the University of Virginia that Margie gave recently as well. And then I published. Those were using old texts I had before. But then I found that my memory was not working as well as it used to work when I wrote a big book, where I felt that I had in my head not only all the books I'd written, but a lot of Shakespeare and Homer and the Bible. And when I was writing, I could call on all of those, besides what I actually thought I was writing about, which made the books have the quality they had of kind of miscellaneous knowledge. Couldn't do that anymore. And when I translated Sanskrit, I found I could read the Sanskrit okay, but I was mainly using the Sanskrit dictionary, which I hardly used to use in the old days. Not because I didn't know the Sanskrit, but because I couldn't think of the right English word I wanted to translate the Sanskrit. So I'd come across Han, which I knew meant to kill or to injure or to hurt. But there was another word I wanted. I said, that's right, to strike. That's the word I wanted. So I felt I couldn't go on writing the same kind of books I'd written, but I don't know who I am if I'm not writing a book. So I had to do something. So I found when I was checking out of my wonderful office here, some letters I'd written to my parents in 1963 when I was 23 years old. They all began, "Dear Mommy and Daddy." And they were the letters I'd written from India. They were interesting letters, so I published them. Then I did a translation from the Mahabharata, the last books of the Mahabharata after the war. And that's when I discovered I was using the Sanskrit dictionary for English rather than for Sanskrit and so forth. But I got through with that. So I thought that I needed a smaller, manageable project. And then I remembered these two books of the Mahabharata, 12 and 13, which I had never read. Most people don't read them because they're excruciatingly boring. They're like Deuteronomy. They're the books on what you're supposed to do and not to do. They're the advice to the king, how to be a good king, do this, don't do that, and so forth. And so I thought that I would look at them and take the plums out of the plum pudding, find the good things in them, because one way that you teach a king how to be a king is to tell him stories about other kings who made terrible mistakes that you must never make, or succeeded by cultivating virtues that you must cultivate. These stories then are the source, this advice, these books 12 and 13, these boring books, are the advice to the king that is given by the old king. A lot of them went into the Arthashastra, a textbook of politics, a trick reader to Kautilya, which is a wicked, wicked book. It makes makes Machiavelli look like sort of Lord Fauntleroy. It's a really wicked book. It's also full of animal stories that are the source of what people think of as Aesop's fables, which are not Greek or Latin stories, but are really Indian stories that we know through Greek and Latin and indeed Arabic sources as well. So there's gold in them thar hills. There was something to do, so I leafed through the whole book and I found some stories that I really liked, that I thought would be of interest to modern readers. The story of the dog, so glad there's a dog present, is a story about a dog who comes to work for an ascetic. He comes to live with the ascetic in the forest. And the ascetic lives on fruits and roots, which is mulafala, which is like sackcloth and ashes. It's the word for asceticism of kind. So the dog wanted to be a disciple, so he lived on fruits and roots and garbage, because he's still a dog. So he serves him, he meditates, he does all this stuff. It's partly a satire on the guru-chela relationship. And then a tiger comes and he says, the tiger will kill me. The guru turns him into a tiger. Then an elephant comes, he says, the elephant will kill me. So he turns the tiger that was a dog into an elephant. And in the end, a great Shadaba comes, which is a mythological beast. He says he's going to kill me, so he turns him into a Shadaba. And then when the dog is a Shadaba, he thinks, well, I can do whatever I like. And he turns and he's going to eat the sage. And the sage says, no you don't, sonny, and turns him back into a dog. So this is not a story about dogs. This is a story against upward mobility in caste. You are what you are, don't try to be something else. Then there's another story about a jackal. Jackals, like dogs, they're related to them, of course, are unclean. They haunt cemeteries and so forth, or burial grounds in India. Nobody likes jackals. They're slimy. They have a very bad reputation in folklore. I've never actually known a jackal. They may be perfectly nice people, but their reputation is of being slimy. But this jackal decides he wants to be good. He wants to change caste. He doesn't say that. He says, I don't want to eat meat anymore. I don't want to live in the cemetery. I want to eat vegetables. I want to be a good one. And the jackals say, you were born a jackal. They give him the line that they would have given the dog, as it were, in the other story. Stay who you are. Don't try to be upwardly mobile. But he says, no, I don't believe in killing people, I don't believe in lying, and he becomes the minister. Jackals are always the advisor to lions. He becomes the minister to the tiger king. The tiger is actually the king of beasts in all of these stories, not the lion. And the other jackals wanted to behave like a jackal. There's a big palace and tree, and the king is full, and he's about to kill this really good jackal. And his mother, I love this story because it's the mother. The mother of the tiger comes and says, you're out of your mind. This is a really good person, this jackal. The others are lying. And he says, you're right, you're right. And he gets rid of the other jackals, and this jackal becomes his prime minister. But he says, you'll never trust me again after that. And he goes back into the forest and lives as an ascetic. So this is a story with a very different moral. What I want to say here is that the Mahabharata is dealing with a series of changing ethical problems during a period of 600 important years, approximately, we don't know, our bar is enormous, about 300 BCE to 300 CE. A long time when the caste system is being challenged, but is also digging in its heels and saying, we're not going to give up. There's another story in the Mahabharata also about a dog who wants to go to heaven, and the question is, can he come in or out? And there's no answer. He can't go to heaven because he's dirty, but he can go to heaven because he's a bhakta, he's a devotee. And the Mahabharata says, well, can he or can't he? And the answer is, abracadabra, there wasn't any dog. It was just an illusion. It was the god of Dharma pretending to be a dog. So in other words, the Mahabharata is saying, we want to tell you we have a problem of two conflicting ethical systems, and we can't solve that problem. Here it is, and it just leaves it like that. So it's a very exciting period in the history of ethics in India, history of folklore, and so forth. So that's about animals. A few minutes about women. The image of women in this text is stupendously horrible. It is just so bad. Again and again, these diatribes, you can't trust them, they're slimy, they're lustful, they'll sleep with anybody, they lie, they were created in order to destroy people. There's many, many, many terrible stories. But there are some other stories as well. So there's a very important, much retold myth in the Mahabharata, in other texts as well, that Indra, the king of the gods, who's Zeus, who's Wotan, who's always promiscuous and seduces people, and a shape changer. He comes and he seduces a woman named Ahalya, who's the wife of a very famous sage named Gautama. The situation is that the sage in these stories is an old man, and he has a young, gorgeous wife. He often also has a young disciple, and you can figure out how that happens, and there's several stories about that also in the Mahabharata. But on this occasion, Indra takes the shape of somebody else and basically seduces Ahalya. She commits adultery. They invent adultery. This was the first adultery. She's cursed to become a stone, or she's cursed to become invisible. The story is retold. So that's a very much retold story. The Mahabharata tells it twice, quite differently. The Mahabharata says that Gautama and Ahalya had a son named Chirakaran, which means someone who takes a long time, or is a procrastinator, someone who puts off action. So Gautama leaves his ashram to perform a sacrifice, and he says to Chirakaran, your mother has committed a sin, I want you to kill her. When I come back, I want her to be dead. He goes off. So the kid says, what am I going to do? You've got to do what your father tells you, but you're really not supposed to kill your mother. And there's a long, long thing about how wonderful mothers are, you mustn't kill them, and how important it is to obey your father, how important it is to obey your father. So he goes on and 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 on. And finally, Gautama comes back and says, well, did you do it? He said, well, I haven't. He says, I'm so glad you didn't do it. She was really innocent. The woman doesn't really commit adultery. It was the man's fault for seducing her. I'm so glad you didn't kill her. So the story of Ahalya, I've read 30 versions of it. This is the only one I know where he doesn't kill her, where he says actually it wasn't her fault at all. So again, you have different moral voices in these little stories, and you have the image of a text thinking aloud. trying to think out these questions, which in later Hinduism went one way or another. Ahalya is an adulteress, she must never commit adultery, or whatever it is. There's a time when things are being, these stories are being breeded about for the first time, not for the first time, they're being breeded out in a way which has not yet solidified, is what I want to say. And that's why they're wonderful stories, and they aren't just about dogs, although stories about dogs are very important, and they are often about women, and many of them are about very bad women, but mostly they're actively thinking about moral questions. They haven't gotten all the answers, so it isn't really like Deuteronomy, where I know the answer and I'm telling you the answer. These are important moral questions, and this is the best we can do with them at the moment, which is why I like these stories so much. That's why I wrote the book. Thank you.
Well, I just have to say at the start that this is a hilarious reversal. When Wendy and I taught together in the early 90s, Wendy would write out her entire lectures. And she would come into the room and with a flourish hand me a copy. And I lectured extemporaneously from notes. Today she spoke from notes and I'm reading from the text. So
You didn't tell them what happened when you read my notes.
I didn't. We'll get to that if they want to hear about it in the
Some of my notes.
Lots of stories, but anyway. Wendy would insert profanity next to the names of scholars she didn't like. But she wouldn't read the profanity. So she would say expletive, 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 Talal Assad. Talal Assad. And so I'm sitting there laughing. And she was like, what is he laughing at? There, okay.
Thank you.
Super. All right. Well, I'm going to read this. So sincere thanks to Dee Robinson for the invitation to speak at this particular forum, and bountiful thanks to Wendy Doniger for writing and seeing into print the Dharma of Unfaithful Wives and Faithful Jackals, her umpteenth book. It's a relief to witness such productivity in the emeritus years. Wendy and I have been colleagues in Swift Hall since 1991. We remain so despite the fact that in a rather heedless moment she abandoned the school by retiring. It's a pleasure to see her back where she truly belongs, and to salute her at this particular, and I trust only the latest, of the many crossings that have enhanced the last decades for so many of us. As Wendy acknowledges in her preface, I have lifted the stories out of the moral diatribes in which they are embedded, rather like picking the plums out of a plum pudding. Once you've digested the onomatopoeia in that sentence, which I didn't render very well, notice juxtaposition of ethics with eating, and her preference for the latter over the former. At the same time, Wendy chooses for her subtitle to designate these stories as moral tales, and it seems clear that she does not regard this formulation as an oxymoron. So the book presents a fun little puzzle from the get-go, one that I think animates the book in very useful ways. The implication seems to be that morals, at least in the Mahabharata, can take the forms of diatribe and story, and it will be no surprise to those who know Wendy well that she vastly prefers the latter to the former. Subtler, perhaps, and worthy of notice that the word moral need not in the end be consumed by the word diatribe. It can survive, is reincarnated, perhaps in this book by Wendy herself, as tale. This book is thus a case of the tail wagging the diatribe. Pause for laughter. Sorry.
Very good.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you very much.
It seems to me that Wendy's particular moral sensibility is best captured in her definition in the opening pages of the idea of Dharma, which she describes as religion, morality, social duty, the way things ought to be. I noted this with a smile as I read it, because I know that Wendy herself knows perfectly well, and is, I suspect, the source of the suspicion, not to say outright disgust with diatribe. The way things ought to be is not always congruent with religion, morality, and social duty. Indeed, it is often the case that those three worthies directly interfere with the way things ought to be. So Hindu Dharma is a complex proposition, and it is thus significant to a moralist of Wendy Doniger's stripe. I've waited decades to say that sentence.
Immoralist?
No, moralist. It's moralist. Don't you edit me. That Bhishma addresses Yudhisthira's explicit and possibly rather urgent requests for counsel with stories. And what Wendy affords us in this quite wonderful book is a collection of those moments, a collection which shows that stories teach us that, quote, the way things ought to be is not always the way things turn out, but perhaps equally important, B, the sense of the way things ought to be and can and indeed usually is at work in some way in a tale, in a way that it may not, and perhaps and often, if not always, is not in a diatribe. There is also the problem that diatribes are exceedingly long, and one can easily imagine that reading them for the moral nugget would be tedious in the extreme. This means that the most significant word in this book is how. Wendy makes it preface every one of the 36 tales she translates here. The weight of that how seems to me to designate this is what happened, even this is how what happened. The reader is meant to understand Bhishma's point that the first order of business in facing a moral quandary is to get the facts straight, and the second is to reckon with the overarching consideration that what happens has a cause that must be acknowledged. Diatribes are dangerous because they resist both the facts and the cause. Tales are moral because they offer a corrective to the overreactions of diatribe. So, how the mouse escaped from the cat, the owl, the mongoose, and the hunter, my personal favorite among the 36 stories Wendy has rendered here, answers the question of how a king who is weak and surrounded by powerful enemies on all sides, alone without allies, can survive. The story Bhishma tells reveals the mouse to be a brilliant political thinker who is able to persuade his chief nemesis, a cat who happens to have been trapped in a net, to become his ally against the threats to the two of them from a sharp-toothed owl, a malign mongoose, and a heavily armed hunter. The desperate cat agrees to go along with the mouse's plan, indeed is eloquent and largely complacent in doing so. The mouse's plan works, liberating the cat and allowing mouse and cat alike to take their respective refuges in the top branches and the roots of a huge banyan tree where they cannot be attacked. Once the owl and the mongoose and the hunter leave in frustration, the cat suggests to the mouse that his plan works so well that they should become friends and spend time together. The mouse is unpersuaded.
It's a smart mouse.
When the cat had said these words of supreme conciliation to the mouse, who knew the cat's ultimate objective, replied with these smooth words about what was for his own benefit. Lomasha, I've heard all that you've said. Now listen as I tell you how it seems to me. Friends can take the form of enemies, and enemies can take the form of friends. No one is born an enemy, nor is a friend simply found. They become friends and enemies because of the interaction of their abilities and their goals. There is no permanent friendship, not any enduring enmity. A friend may become an enemy in the course of the vicissitudes of time, and an enemy may become a friend. Self-interest is the most powerful factor. A mother and a father will abandon their own beloved son if he has fallen. People protect themselves. This is the essence of self-interest. The mouse continues. You speak honeyed words. You are dear to me. But all of that is lying. What reason is there for me to think that I am dear to you? We know of none other than for the sake of becoming your food. For a while in the past, as long as there was a cause, we two were friends. But that friendship disappeared along with the cause that was determined by the moment in time. For you are my perpetual and ultimate enemy, and only our shared goal made us friends. When that task was ended, our natures reverted to their enmity. You have no other purpose at all for me than eating me. I am the food and you are the eater. I am weak and you are strong. Given this uneven power, there can be no alliance between us. I admire your intelligence, so that immediately after being set free, you are hunting for something to eat, which is doubtless what you need to be happy. But you were caught because you were after food, and as soon as you got free, you went out hungry. And you are trying to make an alliance with me today in order to eat me, though I am a person who knows the textbooks. For I know that you are hungry and that it is your feeding time. Once you've made an alliance with me, you will hunt me again to eat me. If your dear wife and your sons see you united with me, how would they not eat me quite happily, thrilled and affectionate though they may be to see you? As the mouse went on talking this way, the cat became nervous. Quickly he went into his own hole. Then the wise mouse went to another hole. And thus the mouse overcame many powerful enemies, because though he was weak and alone, He was wise and smart. Now here the way things should be, to use Wendy's phrase, is different at different times. The moral of the story is that the game of cat and mouse is in fact several different games, each dictated by the respective interests of the two parties. The mouse is much the wiser and it seems more moral character because he realizes the chief implication of all this. Someone in power, even someone as seemingly lowly as a mouse, can find and exploit an advantage. The further moral is not to allow the success of that advantage to distort fundamental realities. The cat will always be a cat. The mouse will always be a mouse. And their shared situation in extremis, however happily resolved, does nothing to change that. Thinking morally about how moral tales teach us concerning the way things should be is thus at once energizing and sobering. One can exercise ingenuity and triumph in any difficult situation, but assuming that such an exercise, when successful, will change the fundamental nature of a fellow creature is the most foolish of errands. The moral plum in the diatribe pudding is this, and the morality of Wendy Doniger is the insistence that we enjoy the true flavor of the dish, rather than risking indigestion or worse by eating every last morsel. Now, reading these stories and thinking these thoughts has led me to recall the philosophy of Suzanne Langer. Her book, Feeling and Form, resonates deeply with what Wendy shows us here. Langer has a special interest in the ways that literary forms modulate cultural feeling. Thinking in her own case of the ancient Greek festival of Dionysus, she suggests that comedy and tragedy and satyr plays that represent the known myths of that culture aim to recalibrate the social mood by reminding it of its most enduring truths. Langer does not put it the way Wendy puts it here, but it is clear in both cases that stories do the most fundamental religious work for a culture. They remind their hearers of the most basic truths, recall people to the values that are too easily lost in the hurly-burly that is daily life. Now, I cannot conclude without resisting one further note and then an anecdote. The note is this: because this is a work of translation, it is, with nary a reference to Gadamer or Kerr, a work of hermeneutics, a negotiation of how meaning exists across very different historical contexts. Now, on the one hand, my strong suspicion is that hermeneutics is nearer to, rather than farther from, diatribe in Wendy's personal moral lexicon. On the other hand, Wendy has been not only an assiduous but a superb translator of Sanskrit texts throughout her scholarly life. I would suggest in concluding the complementary observation that her work has displayed the same abiding regard for meaning that, as we see in this volume, she also has for morals. In both cases, they just need to be properly understood. Oh, and whether it's the moral or the meaning, or both, that we're talking about, always frame it in a story. That is the way things should be.
Thank you.
Can I tell my anecdote real quickly?
Tell your anecdote.
There's a great Swift Hall story that I first heard from Chris Gamwell about how to be dean here. And the story goes like this. You don't get a manual on being a dean, as Steve Robinson knows well. The story is that you walk into the dean's office on the first day and the desk is empty for you, except that there's a central drawer, and you open it, and there are 2 envelopes in there, and they're labeled. And the first one says to be opened on the occasion of your first crisis. And the second one says to be opened on the occasion of your second crisis. And so Chris said he became dean, and things were going well for about a year, and then the honeymoon ended, and things started to go south, and he went into the desk, and he got out the first envelope, and he opened it. And there was a piece of paper inside, and he opened the piece of paper, and it said, blame everything on me. And he blamed everything on his predecessor, and the problem went away, and things were fine for a while, but eventually things heated up again. And he was pretty worried, so he went back to the office, and he pulled out the second envelope, and he opened it up, and there was a piece of paper inside, and he opened the piece of paper, and it said, prepare 2 envelopes.
The morals of being a dean. Have you ever tried to clean a dean room also?
We could do old jokes the whole
Well,
time.
we could
That's why we're here.
indeed.
How about the Philip statue?
No.
So these are indeed moral tales, and what I think I tried to make clear, and I think you understood it. Well, the mouse tale is a wonderful one. The Mouse Tale is really strictly out of political science. That's that kind of, that particular morality. But in fact, it's from the Arthashastra, which is a very, by Whitney, which is a very immoral book. The morality of the Arthashastra, as I said, it makes Machiavelli look like Fauntleroy, is lie, cheat, stick him before he sticks you, and so forth and so forth. It's a spectacularly immoral book. So there are, in classical formulations of Hinduism, 3 basic areas that a human being, they have in mind, a male human being always, but it can work for anybody, should encompass in a life. 3 things you should care about before you die. One is artha, one is dharma, and one is kama. Artha is political success, money, success, getting what you want, power. Kama is not just the Kama Sutra, not just funny positions. Kama is pleasure in the broadest sense, which includes sexual pleasure, but it's also good music, wearing silk clothes, and eating good food, and so forth. That's the world of Kama. And the third is Dharma, which is the world of social justice, living in the community and being kind to the poor and old ladies and doing what you should do in the moral sense that we would accept as a moral sense, but also it's caste. It's Hindu Dharma. It's sticking to the rules of caste in ways which many of us now think are actually immoral. But it's morality, those are the 3 things in a human life. Pleasure, success, and decency, human decency. It used to be translated as religion, but it's only just a particular piece of religion. Later on, when people started inventing Buddhism and other religions in India, and there were also ascetic movements within Hinduism, some people, only some people, added a 4th goal, which was moksha, which is release from normal human affairs, meditating and leaving the first 3, never mind dharma, artha, and kama, getting out of that whole world. But at the time of the Mahabharata, moksha was not yet a 4th goal, and for some people it never became. So what I want to say is this, that although the Mahabharata is supposed to be a Dharma text, it's actually called a Dharma Shastra, and the section from which these stories come is often called the Dharma section. There's also a Moksha Dharma section. There's also a lot of artha in it, because it's written for and about and by kings. And the morality of kings is only part Dharma and a great deal artha. So you have this really interesting mix in these books for kings. The Raja Dharma section, the section on how kings should behave, on the one hand of being kind to the poor and not telling lies, and on the other hand, the mouse story, which is kick him before he kicks you, don't believe anybody, there's no such thing as real friendship, and so forth and so on. So the Mahabharata is already playing at least 2 very important games at the same time. And at the same time, they're beginning to deal with moksha, with stories about people who have goals which are neither dharma nor artha, but a kind of religious truth, a kind of religious liberation of various kinds. And there are stories about this, also a moksha dharma section. And so the text is simultaneous. So what I love about, well, there are a lot of things I love about its great stories, but it's very honest in simultaneously facing different parts of the same story. There's another text about a dog, in another, that I translated in the other book after the war, another book from the end of the Mahabharata, where Yudhishthira, who's a very good king and is actually the incarnation of Dharma as a god. He has a son who is Yudhishthira. He's the incarnation of goodness, moral righteousness, goodness. He goes to heaven, and on the way as he's climbing up the mountain to heaven, a dog comes and just stays with him the way dogs do. And finally, Yudhishthira is all alone, and his brothers, his wife, everybody's dropped away. It's just Yudhishthira walking to heaven. He gets to the gate, and they say, Yudhishthira, come in, you have been such a good king that you, among all human beings, are unique. You're going to walk into heaven with your body. Other people die and their souls may go to heaven, but uniquely come into heaven. You can do this. And Yudhishthira says, great, love to, and I'll bring my dog. And they say, actually, you can't bring the dog. And then they switch into Dharma Hinduism, old-fashioned Dharma. Dogs are unclean. You know that story, the dog and the jackal, and dogs eat garbage. You can't have garbage. Jews and Hindus are alone in my knowledge of religion in caring not only about what food you eat, but about the vessels on which you serve food. They're really obsessed about clarity and purity of food, those two religions. And Jews don't like dogs, and Hindus don't like dogs, classically. So you can't bring the dog in. So Yudhishthira says, this dog is my bhakta, which is a word that's just appearing in Hinduism in this 3rd BCE to 3rd CE period. A bhakta is someone who's devoted to you. He's your disciple, he's your chela, he stays with you, he's your person, he's your helper, he's your pupil, he's your acolyte. All those things. A bhakta is a very important, someone who's devoted to you. And Yudhishthira says, abandoning someone who's devoted to you is a sin equal to killing a Brahmin, which is by defining sin in these texts by Brahmins, is killing. Brahmahasha, that's it. So he says it's just as bad as killing a Brahmin. And they say, yeah, that may be very good, but when dogs are let in, they'll lick the sacrificial offerings, and we won't be able to do sacrifices. Classical Hinduism can't have dogs. So here you have, again, a trivial incident, but two big principles are at stake. One is ritual purity, which is really important to Hindus to this day. It's an important part of a certain kind of Hinduism. And devotion to people who are devoted to you. Especially, but not only, the guru-pupil relationship. A bhakta is often a devotee, but it's also a devoted servant who will give his life for you. Your wife can be your bhakta, someone who just loves you and has been following you. And so the question is, which one will win in this situation? Is the dog going to get in or not? And the answer is yes. Namely, the Mahabharata punts. They say, actually, look at the dog. There's no dog. It's Dharma, who took the form of a dog. It was just a test. This was just a test. In case of a real nuclear attack, you'll have other things going on. This was just a test. And indeed, they remind him he's been tested before in various ways. And you passed the test. Namely, the right thing to say was, I won't go into heaven I won't break the ritual rules of heaven. I will stick to the rule of devotion. But then it means you can come to heaven. So again, the Mahabharata just walks you up to a historical moment when two very different sorts of religions are fighting for the minds and hearts of Hindus, and says, we can't deal with it. We don't have the answer, but we want you to think about it. And that dog story is a very famous story in India. I happen to be an addict of Dear Abby. I read her every day. And on October 28th, there was a series of letters in response to a woman who said, my priest or rabbi or whatever it was says, I can't take my dog with me when I go to heaven. Can a person take a dog to heaven? That was the question. Many, many answers in response, and one of them said, there's an old story about a guy who went to heaven with his dog, and he did this, and at that point, they said to him, this is the third test, which is the sign that he stole this from the Mahabharata, because I didn't mention to you that Dharma had appeared twice before to Yudhishthira and tested him. So in the Mahabharata, they say, this is the third test. But in this letter that they were writing to Dear Abby, there was no test at all. So he gave away his source in that. So it still is a question in the minds of people reading and writing to Dear Abby in October of 2024. And the answer in this case was indeed, of course, you can take your dog to heaven. Dear Abby had no questions about that. She didn't consult her Orthodox Jewish friends. She didn't consult her high caste Hindu friends. She just knew that you can take your dog to heaven. So now you know too. time to talk to people.
Open up for questions.
There are people here who know what I was talking about. One in the back and then the one in the front.
Well, I read the book, The Implied Spider, I read the book.
Implied spider.
I speak loud enough.
I can hear him, I can hear him.
Okay. I read your book in Professor Wetter's course, and I'm reading it for my doctoral exam. So in my mind, I associate your name with comparative mythology. Although I think that book should be publicized as having value for the humanities in general. So in that book, you identify myths as stories dealing with insoluble problems. But from our discussion, it seems I don't know if you are shy to call this myth, because the tale seems to be the label you use. So I just wonder if you see this book as fitting in your big project of comparative mythology.
Thank you very much. No, indeed. Indeed it does. At the moment, the books I've been writing have been about India, the last couple of books, but I did keep up with comparative mythology for some years. And indeed, I would say that I have just given you a very good example of an insoluble problem. That story is dealing with the fact that Hinduism at this period in history regarded this as an insoluble problem. Of course, my great mentor in this is Claude Lévi-Strauss. And among the many things he said, some of which I didn't understand, many of which I did understand, he said that the reason there are 4 Gospels, the reason that any great story is told again and again, always differently, is because these are the great myths, and there are a lot of ways of defining myth, but my working definition is a myth that poses an important human question to which there is no answer. Why are we here? Why do we die? Is there a God? If there is a God, why are we having this election? All the questions that you might want to ask. These are the questions. In these recent years I've been mostly doing Indian stories, but I've been writing also actually I'm writing a memoir which is dealing cross-culturally with some of these stories, but I think that I still stand by what I said in the Implied Spider, and I think that my outlook is always broadly comparative. That is to say, the reason I like the stories I like is because I think they're about me. There are problems about dogs, and there are problems about human morals, questions about why we die, which I haven't actually solved myself. And so I find that I like the Hindu stories best because I just think they're the best versions of it. I just think they're more fun. I'd rather read the Mahabharata than Deuteronomy, thank you very much. But that's a taste. That's not a moral judgment. So I always keep coming back to the Indian stories. But as I also live in the world, we went to see Pericles the other day. There's a lot of Shakespeare that's always in my head and that I often weave into a lot of movies. I love old movies, and I often put the old movies into my books about India too. Dear Abby got into my discussion of the Mahabharata. So I share with my great mentor, Eliade, this vision of a united human world in which certain stories are available to everybody and are circulated throughout cultures that they have. Obviously, the Hindus have their own particular meaning, but the story is not just a Hindu story. And it goes with Dear Abby, and it also goes with the Bible in some ways. So I still endorse the agenda of the Implied Spider, that although you only see the web and you never see the spider, I think there is a spider. And that spider is human nature, and the fact that thoughtful human beings keep asking questions to which there are no answers. And keep trying. If you can't find an answer, you can find a kind of an answer. Well, let's go on with this until we get something better kind of an answer. yes, you can take the dog to heaven, no, you can't take the dog. You do one thing or the other. But I think that these are indeed not just Indian stories. They're fun in their Indianness. And it's also interesting to see how the caste system works, which is different to the class system and racism and all the other things we have. But yes, I still abide by the implied spike. I think there is a spike. Yeah. Yes?
So this question is about dogs.
Good.
So
I'm
the
so hungry.
Mahabharata begins with a story about a dog, which I can't remember very well.
Sadama and her sons.
Right, it begins with this treatment of the dog.
Yes,
And I
indeed.
wanted to know if you got a reading of that,
Yeah.
maybe in conjunction with the dog
Yeah,
text.
yeah. Yep, that's good. There's a man who knows his text. Right near the beginning, Sadama, Sadama is the bitch of the king of the gods in the Rig Veda, long before the Mahabharata. The Rig Veda is a book of Sanskrit at the time when, even earlier than when Homer is writing his Homeric stories. It's before, more or less parallel some of the Norse sagas. It's part of the Indo-European mythology of Zeus and Wotan and Thor and Jupiter and Indra. So these kings of the gods are not Indian, they're Indo-European. They come from, it's not universal, but it's a big piece of Indo-European mythology, which we still have. Wagner still telling you about Wotan and so forth. So it's an enduring piece of Indo-European mythology. So it's old. So it's before the people who became the Hindus got to India, and therefore it's before the caste system and the ideas of purity and impurity came. Everybody eats cows in the Rig Veda. Later on, a lot of people in India, not all people, not all Hindus, which is always wrongly said, but many people in India stopped eating cows. But eating cows was the best thing you could do in Homer. It's the best thing you can do in the Rig Veda. So this is an old level of India where Indra, who continues, he's the guy who commits adultery and all these stories that are in the Mahabharata. Indra has a hunting bitch named Sadama, who is a very important and very good character. She's noble. First of all, you need a dog if you hunt. The enemies of the gods capture her, and she sneaks away and goes back to the gods. They think they've corrupted her, but she's lied. She's really loyal to the gods. She comes back. She tells Indra, and Indra conquers the anti-gods, the Asuras, and so forth. So Sadama, the bitch, is an ancient character in the Rig Veda and a very positive character. Then you get the Mahabharata. Time has passed, centuries have passed. We're talking about 1500 BCE for the Rig Veda, 300 BCE, even in India where things don't change, something changes a little bit between 1500 and 300, and you begin to get this idea that dogs are unclean. So there they are in the beginning of the Mahabharata, where some of the dogs, the puppies of Sadama, go to the great sacrifice, which is the whole mise en scène of the whole Mahabharata, and they get driven out by people who say, "You're dogs, you're going to lick the food, you're going to lick the sacrifice, get out of it," and they go back to Sadama. And Sadama wants revenge. And I believe that in that moment of the Mahabharata, you're still on Sadama's side. You know what a great bitch she was, and how important she was, and it was wrong of those people to torment those dogs. And their sin, if I can use a less Hindu word, their mistake, let's just say their serious error of judgment in driving the dogs out and beating them up, is one of the two factors that precipitates the entire tragedy of the Mahabharata. It leads to the snake sacrifice of Janamejaya and all sorts of other things. So that's another, it's good thing you said, that's another moment in the Mahabharata where the dog is the focus of the clash of two ethical moments. And the Mahabharata goes for the wrong moment. That is to say, the people who drive those dogs out are the people who remain the heroes, if I can use that word, of the Mahabharata, and suffer a war and a great deal of terrible losses, in large part because they did the wrong thing to those puppies. It's nice, I should have thought of it. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you so much. This has been very interesting, both presentations. I have 3 comments. First, I want to validate what you said about Jews and Hindus and their food things. My daughter had an opportunity to go abroad for a year, and she was choosing between 5 countries, and we decided on India because she keeps kosher. And
It's the easiest place to keep kosher.
yeah, and she
Don't use that dish.
yes, exactly.
For Chinese, they say, why not use that dish?
On Passover, she said, "This is my pot. Do not touch it." And they were like, "Okay." You know, they understood the pot. The second thing I want to say is I really loved what you said about this deadly text, this deadly boring text, and choosing the nuggets and pulling them out. And because I teach, every Sunday morning, I teach a Parsha class to lay people. It's just, the weekly reading from the Torah. And there are certain times of the year when I wonder, why am I doing this? Right? Particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. And that is my challenge. And that has been one of my most exciting teaching experiences, actually, is to find things from the book of Deuteronomy to narrativize, to
Mary Douglas did it.
yeah,
She wrote a very great book.
yes,
Starting from the boring parts of Deuteronomy.
which is
Very
why
ancient.
which is why I myself write books about the overlap between literature and ethnography. Yeah. And then my final comment or question is, in the book of Deuteronomy, I think there is maybe 1 or 2 allusions to the idea of the king needs to read the Torah every so often on a regular basis in order to educate himself, or and when I teach that part, there's always the question of what exactly does the Torah mean when it says the Torah, right? Does it mean, because the Torah could be just like what just came before in the text, right? It's just a narrative, right? And so I wondered if there's that kind of self-referential, self-consciousness about the function of the book you're talking about as sort of a moral guide for kings, right? Within the book itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. Certainly, I think the parallel works for Judaism, but you know more about that than I do. But certainly, the idea that the king should be the defender of the religion is a widespread idea. And the question is, what is the religion? Is it the Bill of Rights? Is it the Constitution? Is it the Bible? Our founders, I think, assumed that everybody was white and everybody was Christian and everybody was male. But nevertheless, the idea is we have a book, and that book is important to the ruler. People swear on the Bible and so forth. So the idea that the king rules by the book, whatever the book may be, I think is very widespread in cultures that are oral cultures. You have to memorize certain things if you're the king. The thing that's wonderful about the Mahabharata is that it knows damn well that the king doesn't do that he's supposed to do that, but he doesn't. And indeed, the sections that we've been talking about, the mouse section that Rick pulled out, shows that the king has other books besides the Bible that he really needs to rule by, and in this case, it's basically Machiavelli. The gods and the anti-gods, the asuras, have priests, very important right-hand man, Bishop of Canterbury type figures, but they also have a person that I now translate, thanks to my friend Francis Koppel, as the consigliere. It used to be translated as the minister, or the prime minister, but from now what I know about the Godfather, I think the only translation of this right-hand man of the king, who is the man who says the philosophy that the mouse was saying in that book, kick him before he kicks you, don't trust anybody. That's basically the right-hand man of the king in India, and apparently other countries as well, which shall remain nameless. So you have the ideal, which is that the king rules by the Bible, but you also have the well-known fact that he rules by Machiavelli. And indeed, a good king probably knows them both and can use them both in different situations. So it's not an either-or situation. Political rule is a complicated thing, and the texts hope that he will rule by the Bible, but fear that he will in fact, I don't even fear, maybe they also hope that he'll win. If he rules by the Bible, the other kings will kill him. Maybe people hope that he'll rule by Machiavelli. In any case, she does rule by both. Margie.
I want to ask about the diatribe against diatribe. So, as Rick was naming that alternative, and you were nodding, but it struck me that the central story we were looking at with the mouse and the cat has a diatribe within it, doesn't it? I mean, would you?
It is a diatribe.
I mean, but I mean, in set, there's speech in character by the mouse, who gets a lot more airtime than does the cat. Would you call that a diatribe? And so that's one question. Then the other, I think this relates to other questions as well, is there any power in persuasion, either within one story or within the collection of stories, such that it's not just unanswerable questions, but that there's a pull to try to persuade you that, you know, the demands of justice are such in a given moment? Or how do you think about that? So, I mean, a diatribe as form and as persuasive speech, and how does that hang over the whole?
Good questions. When I translated the last books of the Mahabharata, in the text called After the War, I translated every word and I numbered the verses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 90. In this book, I summarized long, it's this little tiny book, and it's summarized long. The mouse's speech goes on for pages and pages and pages and pages in the Sanskrit. And I started translating it, and I started falling asleep, and I said, just do this. I looked over the Sanskrit, I picked up, and I ended up translating the bits that I liked and I remembered and so forth. So there's an enormous diatribe in some of these things. It's just a little frame of a story as an excuse to give you pages and pages of Deuteronomy. So that's really sugarcoating a pill in a way. So the mouse said this, then you forget about the cat. So there are indeed long speeches meant to persuade, and they do often persuade. The story of the jackal and the tiger's mother, the tiger's mother gives him a little lecture. And it goes on and on and on and on, and I summarized it. And in the end, the tiger says, "You're right, Mom," and does the right thing. He gets rid of the people that were telling him to kill his jackal and so forth. So people change their minds in these stories. There is persuasion, and there is also a lot of very boring diatribes that I summarized, and that other people might enjoy more than I did. So there's that. There is the long speeches, and there's also the fact that people do change their mind. The jackal story ends, the endings always puzzle me in a way. So the jackal's a good jackal. The bad jackals persuade the king that he's not a good person, and the king wants to kill him. The king is about to kill the bad jackal, the tiger king, and the tiger mother comes and says, "Don't listen to those guys. They're all liars. This is really a good jackal." And so he then gets rid of the other guys and says to the jackal, "Good, I trust you, come and be my prime minister forever." And the jackal says, "No way, Jose." So at the end he says, no, you're vulnerable, and he goes off and meditates until he dies. So that's the end of that story. So there are arguments which have different kinds of outcomes. People are persuaded, but sometimes they're not persuaded, or there are other good anti-arguments, and it goes back and forth. Some of these stories are really quite complicated. The story that I told about the procrastinating son who is told to kill his mommy and keeps putting it off. So that's another long story when he says, you've got to do what your daddy says. The father is this, the father is that, the father is this, you must do what your father. On the other hand, the mother is this, you have to always be nice to your mother. Your mother is this, your mother. So there's these long pieces of undigested, really, and undigestible moralizing. And in fact, in this text, he doesn't know which is the right one. He says, I can't kill my mom, I can't disobey my dad. I can't kill my mom, I can't disobey my dad. He goes on and on. there's actually another famous story in India, which everybody knows at this period, which is the story of Jamadagni and Renuka. And Jamadagni's mother is bathing, washing some pots in a river, and a very handsome prince comes by, and she looks and she says, "Oh, what a handsome prince," and goes by bathing her pots. And her husband says, "You're mind straight, you're a slut." And he says to his son, "She has had sluggish thoughts, I want you to kill her, cut off her head." And he does. And he's a famous character, and he's not punished for it. He's punished with Rama with an axe. He's one of the great characters in Indian mythology. So there's another way this story could have ended, which he could have said, "Well, I love my mom, but oh, you kid," and would have cut off. So the story said, "I don't know." And then you have this unusual passage. I don't know everything in India. I just never came across it. It may exist. Which is really, it's not the wife's fault when she's seduced, it's the seducer's fault. Nowhere in this text. And women are sluts, they're always trying to commit adultery, guard them. That's the message of the Mahabharata. Keep an eye on them, they're always when they go to bed, any man they see, life. The idea that the woman is innocent and the man who gets her to break her marriage vow is actually the guilty one. In Hindu law, the woman is supposed to be torn apart by dogs, and then my man pays a fine usually if he's convicted of committing adultery with a married woman. So there's a lot of different dogs in this fight, if I may use the expression. There are a lot of different moral views. There's a classical view of Manu's Dharma Shastra I translated years ago. Don't do this, don't do that. But not everybody believes in Manu. The Mahabharata has several different moral messages, and sometimes they conflict in a single story. And I guess you could cherry pick. If you wanted to go with one or the other, you could find a text to back yourself up. So I chose the messier stories and the ones that challenge the normal view. But there are also conventional ones. The woman is evil, it's always her fault, she's always trying to commit adultery. It's a book, it's a true anthology. It's too big to have a single author. I think, there's an argument, I think it was orally transmitted for a long time before it was ever written down. And then it was written down in lots of different recensions. It's a messy text. Lots of people got their 2 cents into it. You can find different arguments for different things if you want. It's much more complicated than the so-called Dharma Shastras, which usually say yes or no. That's why I like it. It's messy. Yes.
Wendy, are these texts controversial?
Are they
Controversial for you?
Are they controversial? How interesting. Most Indians, most Hindus don't know what's in them. That's just enormous. It's like reading Encyclopedia Britannica. It's not like the Torah, where theoretically people should know what's in it if you're a good guy. Nobody knows what's in the Mahabharata. So people pick the bits and pieces that they want to use for different purposes. One of the most famous ones is the Bhagavad Gita, which is most famous in America, but it's actually not that important a text among Hindus. And the ideas that are in it are not widely accepted by Hindus. They have lots and lots of other texts, including other parts of the Mahabharata. So there's no pope, there's no one to, except Modi nowadays, to tell you what you should or should not believe as a Hindu. That's why Modi is such an aberration as well as a horror. That there never was anyone, you believe this and she believes that and you believe that, and that's just fine. We're all just Hindus. You worship in this temple and you worship in that. That's how Hinduism has always been. This idea of Hindu Torah, that there's this thing that we all believe, is really goes against the whole history of the religion. So normally, the fact that there are different views in the Mahabharata, women are really nice, women are really awful, that's just the way life has been in Hinduism for its thousands and thousands of years of history. The contemporary scene is an extraordinary and unfortunate aberration.
Do you have one more?
Yes, one last one. Thank you very much for your presentation. I am
Is this fine? Okay, all right, cool. How interpretations of narratives can take several forms. And I'm sure with a single story, in different contexts by different people, different morals could be extracted. So I'm wondering how that plays out in the Mahabharata, because it sounds as if, sorry, I haven't read the book yet, but it sounds as if...
But if you haven't read any of it, then that's a mistake. You should read some of it.
I mean your book. I haven't read your book yet. Yes.
Everybody.
But it sounds like there are several layers going on here, right? Like there's the story of the cat and the mouse, but it sounds like that's a story that Bhishma is telling Yudhishthir, and then that is transmitted to the audience as well. Audience includes you, and then through you, us as well. So is there a shifting sense of morality or dharma that comes through in different layers? That maybe it meant the text says one thing, as in maybe the narrative is told in one way. Bhishma finds a different moral from it. How are these different senses of morality, I don't know, like accounted for? Do they show up at all? This is just a little bit of a guess. Yeah, who is the voice of morality? And does that get preserved or does that shift through transmission?
Lots of voices, many different voices. The book as a whole endorses the caste system, and yet there are some important stories which say that people should not treat the so-called untouchables, the Dalits, the way they do, that they're just as good as we are. So there are voices for women, lots of voices in favor of women, just as there are many misogynist voices. So it's a great big text. I'm in the presence of Bible scholars, so I'm not going to get in deep in this, but I do believe that people do choose parts of the Bible that suit their arguments and ignore parts of the Bible that suit their arguments. You can argue for a lot of different things. Never happens. I was afraid I was going to offend you if I said that. And I'm not even a Bible scholar. And you're not even. So it's a great big text. And people either find things by accident or their mommies read different parts of them. There are parts of the Bible, Mahabharata, I don't think anyone has ever read. I don't know if they have. I've never seen them cited in any. It's this enormous text. And there are certain parts like the Gita, which people think is the whole thing, and they say over and over and over again. They retranslate it, and they say, some people say it's the heart of Hinduism, where it's just one little piece, and what it says is very different. And in fact, what it says is it's okay to go to war if you're fighting for a righteous cause, which I think is a bad message. So I'm kind of an anti-Gita person, even though I am a pro-Hindu person in general. So this book you can do anything with, really. And I think people know the bits that their parents read to them in traditional Hinduism. I've taught these courses for years, and in the beginning I didn't have any Hindu students, and in my last decade of teaching I got more and more Indian students in the class, and it was really very nice. And I would tell a story, and a hand would go up at the end, and someone would say, my grandmother told it to me differently. And sometimes this was said belligerently, like, you got it wrong. Sometimes it was said apologetically, like, I guess my granny told it to me wrong, or something like that. But we worked that out, and we discussed the multifacety of variance and so forth. So if you have a room of, well, nowadays people don't read their books anymore, but 10 or 15 years ago, if you had a room of educated Indian people, you would get 7 or 8 different versions of who Ganesha was, what Krishna did, and so forth and so forth. Not only is the Mahabharata very, but there's lots of text. So you really didn't have, except in some of the things like the Hare Krishna movement, which is sort of a strange aberration, or Bodhi, which is another horrible aberration, the idea that there's one way to tell the story. That's just not a Hindu way of thinking at all. And I always loved having these Indian students in my class, and I would just go and tell her granny, and I would say, is there anyone else here who has another version? They say, actually, I'm from Punjab, and the way we tell it is like this, and so forth. And you got a feeling in the class that this was not a place where you had to quote chapter and verse and get it right, but that there were ideas that people were still playing with. I mean, should they let that dog into heaven or not? You know, these are still open questions for people in some ways. Was Draupadi a good woman or a bad woman? Or was Sita a good woman or a bad? Everyone knows Sita was a good woman, but there are more and more versions of the story coming out in which Sita is a very naughty girl indeed. What? Sita? So forth. So it depends on what century you're in and what part of India you're in, but the general idea that children are raised with these stories and people know these stories and that they're almost never told exactly the same is, I think, one of the great strengths of Hinduism, always has been. Some of the early Christian observers thought it wasn't a religion at all because they couldn't figure out what the story was. They thought of different religions. The Indians have many different religions that some of the early Jesuits that got there because they said, what's your story? And then they said, no, that's not the story. What is the story? And so forth. So it has had that quality. And I think also people have found the bits they liked and they stuck with it. They heard 6 different versions of the story. They said, that's the one I'm going with. Gita Govinda, Jayadeva's version of that story is very popular and lots of people love that and so forth. So there are different local varieties. In Bengal they favor this, and in Tamil Nadu they favor that, and so forth. But I don't know anyone who knows anything about India who thinks there's one version of any story, a single version of any story.
And with that,
On that note?
yeah, there was only one way of thinking.